Welcome to the Grieving with God podcast. I'm your host, Dawn Byington. This week we had some technical difficulties and we were not able to release our episode on Wednesday morning as we usually do. So here I am, late on Thanksgiving night, trying to get it released today. So this week we have a special episode. I'm not interviewing one person, I'm interviewing two. And actually we are all co-hosting it together. The topic is Thanksgiving, and how do we handle the holidays with family who just don't understand what we're going through? Or how do we handle holidays when we are just sad? So hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to the Grieving with God podcast. I'm your host, Dawn Byington, and today I have with me Kelsey Sanders and Yolanda Smith. Welcome. Could you guys introduce yourselves a little and kind of tell us about yourselves? Kelsey, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I'm Kelsey Sanders. I live with my husband in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and in my 9 to 5, I work in public health.
Okay, great. And Yolanda, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here. My name is Yolanda, and I live in Cliffside, North Carolina with my husband, Alex, and my 10-year-old daughter, Keaton, and 2 adult daughters. I have a lot of other adult children, but they don't live near here. So, and my daytime job is a homeschooling mom.
Yes, I have been there. I miss those days. I do. And I love, Yolanda, you have Christmas up already. I'm very excited for Christmas.
Yes. All things Christmas.
Yes. So today we're talking about the holidays. And so I think it's fitting that we have a Christmas tree in the back. So this will air hopefully on Thanksgiving, the day before Thanksgiving. And so we're talking about holiday seasons and grief and navigating time with our family, especially if family doesn't understand or maybe doesn't know the sadness or sorrow that we're carrying or the extent of that. How do we get into a group setting with people when we're sad? And so that's kind of like what we're going to be navigating and talking about today. So does anybody have, a thought about that, like navigating maybe an experience or a story about a Thanksgiving or a holiday event where you were sad or something was going on and you were gathered around a table with family and friends? All right. And Yolanda, looked like you were getting ready to say something.
I was going to say, I don't necessarily have an experience of being around the table with family during a season of grief, other than a year when my children were small and I wasn't very good at grieving at that time. So I tried very hard to hide my sadness for the sake of my children. And it was actually Thanksgiving was the holiday we were navigating. And I knew that my children were sad as well. I had just recently become a single mom. And so their dad was no longer part of their lives. And we had no outside family support during that time. I lived far away from family. So attempting to make the holiday fun and special while still acknowledging that we were all grieving was really difficult. And I don't think I navigated that super well for them. We did, in an effort to make things a little bit different, we actually made a lot of non-traditional foods that year because I didn't want traditional Thanksgiving feast to be attached to all of this sadness. And that worked really well for us. But now I find myself in a season of being estranged from parts of my family. So every holiday carries some grief with it in that way. But I have found that the last few holidays that I've had where that's the case, it's really important to at least acknowledge out loud to myself and my husband what's going on, and to have sort of, for me, a partner in everything that's going on, even if it's not a particular grief that he's carrying. He knows the load I'm carrying and therefore helps to share it. But also, as much as possible, to be able to say out loud, not maybe collectively to the family once we're seated around the table, hey, I'm going through something really hard right now, but to just talk with everyone individually ahead of time so that they know if I need to jump up from the table and run in the bathroom and cry for a minute, that's fine. I'm perfectly fine. And we don't necessarily need to address that during a time that's supposed to be celebratory and, everyone else is having a great time. But I do want them to understand what's going on. And not even
Mhm.
always having explanation for it. Sometimes it's just, hey, I'm going through a really hard time right now. And I don't really want to talk about it further at this point, depending on the person
Yeah.
I'm speaking with, of course. Um, and also just recognizing that family, sometimes they don't know how to handle when you're going through a hard time. So they're going to attempt to minimize or just
Yeah.
skirt around whatever is going on. And I don't want to make them feel sad or guilty for having a good time when I'm having a
Mhm.
hard time, right? And I also don't want to allow their responses to cause anger or bitterness to well up in me because I'm sad, I'm struggling. Therefore, you should be sad and struggling as
Mhm.
well, because that's
Mhm.
often not the case.
Yeah. Those are great points. I love what you said about making the non-traditional foods so that they weren't associated with negativity down the road with your kids. I love that. I think that that's important too, and that shows that you were really aware of what was going on in your world, and making conscious choices about how to move forward. I really like that a lot. I did like what you said about because I kind of been in this situation where we don't want to get bitter over our family's responses to what
Right.
we're going through, because sometimes they don't know.
Mhm.
But there was one year when I had my first miscarriage, and it was a couple of weeks before Thanksgiving, and the only person in my family who knew was my mother.
Mm.
And I was catching myself getting irritated, rubbed the wrong way, sad and mad that here I am, I'm sad and I'm grieving and you're having fun. And so that was on me at that point, not my family, to check myself and
Mhm.
say,
Mhm.
hey, they're not responsible for that. And I didn't say anything. So I can kind of give them a little grace, in this season to hey, they're having fun and joking and they have no idea what's going on. So I can give them grace with my sadness and whatever. So I really like that too. Um, anything, Kelsey, on your end about family gatherings with when you're going through something hard?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would say that I would echo the feelings of like, I think my experience being with family when you're going through something difficult, is that feeling of like, I can tell that people don't quite know what to do around me, don't quite
Mm-hmm.
know what to say, and, or don't know quite know how to navigate it. And I have a lot of sympathy for compassion for that feeling of like being around somebody who's going through something weighty and feeling like, oh, do they want me to say something? Do they not want me to say something? So I can definitely understand that it is complicated, but also that feeling of like, okay, I don't want to derail the celebratory nature of holidays. Like, I don't want to derail like us all being together and having a good time. And for a long time, I think I put a lot of pressure on myself to just like buck up and have a good time and,
Yeah.
not bring down the mood and just, yeah, and it's still like a recipe for a lot of anxiety for me is an event with a lot of people and a lot of emotional expectations. I feel
Uh-huh.
immediately tense. I feel immediately like, but what if I can't emotionally get to the place that everyone around me is because of what is going on inside of me? And um,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, I think a couple of things that have helped sometimes in the moment, sometimes only after the fact. But, I think one, just remembering that, God sees me in all of the complicated
Mm.
things that are swirling around inside of me. Because it's not often, I feel like in grief or in suffering, it's not just one emotion. Like there is the
Yeah.
weight of what you're going through and sadness, but that doesn't mean there's also not joy to be had. And
Mm.
so I think
Yes.
for me, taking some of that pressure off of myself to just get into the spirit, just have a good time, just be glad you're all together and enjoy it, taking
Yeah.
some of that pressure off of myself by saying like, hey, God sees that it's really messy under this. And
That's good.
it's okay if amidst the good of the holidays, there's also some sadness. And yeah, I think that's been helpful to me. And then too, being married, my husband is the first to be like, "Hey, why don't you go take a break?" It seems like
Oh,
maybe
that's good.
seems like maybe
Yes.
you would benefit. And I'm like, I feel so guilty. We're all together. We don't get to be together all that often because we live, far away from each other. And I'm like, I have to soak up every minute and enjoy this. And Adam's like, but you're not enjoying it. Go take
That's
10 minutes.
good.
Yeah, take 10, 15 minutes, lay down, read a book, like just come back and you'll enjoy it more. And I'm like, no, it's true. So
Yeah.
I feel like giving
Oh,
him reminding me that I have permission to do that. Which I've always had. I just need somebody to be like, hey, it's gonna be okay. It's gonna be okay.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's an amazing buffer, built-in
Oh
buffer that you have.
yeah. Oh yeah.
And for him to be aware and to know your cues to say, "Hey, go take a break and you'll feel better and it's okay. Don't feel
Yeah.
guilty." Like that's awesome. That's so amazing.
Yeah.
Um, do you ever feel, and the thought came up when we were talking, do you ever feel that maybe because I know all three of us have experienced deep grief and sadness, and sometimes during holidays, do you ever have a feeling where like, okay, maybe it's better I just don't go? Like,
Mm.
what's the thought on that? Should I not go to the family event because I'm sad or feeling sad and I'm going to bring it down? What are your thoughts on that?
Mm. Honestly, I think it depends on when I'm talking about the holidays, I think of the end of the year holidays, and they are, at least in my family, they're really celebrated. They're like the holidays that are prioritized and us all being together. So I think for me, it has always felt like that's not an option to not go. It's like
Yes.
this is the one that really matters. And so yeah, honestly, no, not really. I think there's been maybe some
Yeah.
smaller holidays where I've considered like, okay, well, maybe if I'm just not in the mental space to
Mm-hmm.
participate in Mother's Day stuff, that's okay. I
Mm-hmm.
can just make a phone
Yeah.
call. So yeah, I think the end of the year holidays, at least in my family, they're just like a big deal. And so
Mm.
I have it's like literally never crossed my mind, which is funny. So
Okay. That's good. That's good. But yeah, I like the, Mother's Day, maybe that's a celebration I skip because it's too hard or
yeah.
yeah, that's good. Yolanda, any thoughts about like, oh, maybe I just shouldn't go?
Well, I sort of am like Kelsey. I don't have an option. My house is generally the hub where everybody collects. So
Oh, yes.
to say no, you can't come here because I'm not up for it. Um, However, I do, much like Kelsey, I have some spaces where I can escape to in my house if I need to take
Mhm.
some time off. And that periodically happens. And I'm finding as I get older and I'm more in tune with my emotions,
Yes.
that's, I'm much more aware of that need now than I used to be, where during holidays, sometimes I just stayed dysregulated and I would usually end up physically sick the
Yeah.
day following, sometimes even the day of holidays. So I think it's super important to acknowledge when something is feeling a little bit tense, a little bit amiss, or we're feeling
Mhm.
dysregulated, that it absolutely is not only a gift to ourselves, but to the entire family for us to take a few minutes to step back and, as Kelsey said, take a nap, do some deep breathing.
Yeah.
For
Mhm.
me, often it just means going and crying for 2 or 3 minutes in the bathroom and then waiting until my face looks normal before
Yes.
returning
Yeah.
to the family. Um,
Yeah.
and I think also what Kelsey said, it's really important to acknowledge during that time that you can be both happy and sad all together. There's a lot of celebration curled around all the grief, and it's
Yes.
perfectly fine that we feel both of those, and not just during the holidays, but really all year long. If you're going through a season of grief, it's not solid grief. You're always
No.
going to find those moments of joy, moments of gratefulness to God for what He's doing. Even in the midst of the grief, you know that He's working and that the
Mhm.
grief itself is a gift of the healing process.
Yes.
Yes.
So just acknowledging all of those things together, I think is really important.
Yeah. No, that's really, really good.
Mhm.
My perspective, the other side of that, is I can receive a blessing by going. And
Mm.
even though not all of my family are believers, I remember, sometimes I get the thought, "Ugh, I just don't want to go to church today." And then I go to church and I'm like, "Oh, wow, that was amazing. God really knew I needed that." And I've had that experience, with the gathering with our family. And it wasn't a holiday. It was actually my mother's memorial. And so my mother passed away December 2017, and then our son passed away January 2018. So they were really close together. And so I had really, really heavy grief. I mean, just getting up in the morning was very difficult. And my mother's memorial was in March, which was her birthday and Ezekiel's due date. And so it was, it was all this really heaviness. And I'm like, I don't want to go to her memorial. I just don't want to be there. It's better if I don't go. Nobody really understands what we're going through. I mean, everybody knew that we had lost a son, but nobody was talking about it. And so I was like, I'm not going. I don't want to do this. It's too hard. I'm going to be miserable. I'm going to make them miserable, but I couldn't not go to my mother's memorial. And so the blessing was my cousin, no, this is in South Carolina. My cousin's from Connecticut, and she came to visit, and we were sitting together at the fireplace, and we were just looking at the spread of all my mother's pictures. And we were kind of talking about my mom and like her life and the impact it had on both of us. And she just kind of turned to me and just really gently kind of said, "How are you doing since you've lost your baby? How are you?" And I was just like, oh my gosh. And so being seen, having someone recognize the sorrow I was in, and just taking the time where nobody else was around to just kind of say, "Hey, I see you, and can you talk to me a little bit about what you're feeling?" I mean, I just wept, and I couldn't hold it together. I can't probably hold together now. But it was a blessing. And so sometimes I think about that, and when I get that thought, like, ugh, I just don't want to go. I'm just not up for it. There may be a blessing in there, and it may not be as deep as like someone turning around and saying, "Hey, I see you." It could be something as simple as just seeing the joy on your kid's face or some other niece or nephew's face of a gift that they've gotten, or something silly that they're doing that just kind of brings joy and peace and comfort to your heart. And so yeah, that's the thought I had.
I think also sometimes it is okay to say no. If you had the flu, then you would say, "Hey, I'm not coming because I'm going to infect everyone. But not only that, I feel like garbage." So every now and then, it truly is a gift to ourselves and to everyone else to just take that time for healing. Because if you are really in the throes of grief, if you're in the depths, people aren't going to understand, and you don't understand yourself necessarily what's going on. So taking space might actually be the kindest thing you can do for everyone. And feelings might get hurt. Definitely, there will be family members that don't understand. But if you go, also feelings might get hurt, and family members still aren't going to understand. So sometimes we need to take those few moments and offer ourselves just that space for healing. Dawn, I was thinking about, as you said, sometimes I don't feel like going to church, and then I push through. And that's a really good position to take. And I find myself being there often. But yesterday was a day when I decided not to go to church because hormonally, everything went crazy yesterday morning for me. So I recognized I'm having cramps, I'm having headaches, and I have been that mom, that woman who pushes through in order to go, in order to receive a blessing. And I decided yesterday maybe it would be a bigger blessing for me just to stay home and rest and take care of myself. And in the past, that would have felt selfish. And now I've come to recognize, no, that's actually a gift, and God calls us to rest and to heal. And so sometimes we have to create those quiet spaces for that to happen. And I think a little bit of what Kelsey said, it depends on the situation, and there's a lot of nuance in there. And even individual holidays can be treated differently just depending on what you're going through. But I think sometimes it's okay to say no.
I love that. I love that you brought that up. So we have all these perspectives on how to deal with the holidays, and being able to say, yeah, I need to giving yourself grace in this season as well. And saying, in recognizing, what you can and can't do in that moment. giving grace to our family members who don't understand or don't really know what to say. And sometimes family members are silent simply because they just don't know how to respond. Giving them grace, but I think, yeah, giving us grace in return is very, very important. So, what would we want? I don't know. Maybe this is not a good question. Maybe I'll edit it out later. I don't know. What would we have wanted? Or how would we have wanted our family or friends to have responded to us in these holiday celebrations or just family gatherings? Like, is there something that we would have said, if somebody had done this or somebody did do this and that was really important and I liked it?
That's a good question. I feel like I'm going to reframe it a little bit, Dawn.
Okay, good.
I want to answer the question as, how has what I have gone through and seasons of suffering through the holidays changed how I would react to somebody else suffering?
Oh, that's good. Yes.
So I think for me, this whole experience, a season of suffering and grief, and that did include many seasons of the holidays, has sort of changed me in that I think my worry about saying the wrong thing has sort of quieted, and my compassion and my willingness to acknowledge the hard thing has grown. And so I think for me, even at a celebration, something that's celebratory like the holidays, I feel like I hope that I am more likely to do what I think you said cousin did for you, which is to just, find a moment to put my hand on their back, around their arm and say, "You doing okay?" Just to say, "Hey, I imagine this might be complicated for you. We don't have to talk about it, but I just want to say, I see you and I see what you're going through." And I think my willingness to be a witness to suffering, no matter the context, I hope, I pray that God has continued to cultivate that in me. And so, yeah, I think acknowledging, even in a space that feels like, should I acknowledge it right now? And I think there is an element of nuance. Like recently, I had a friend. I was in a situation where it was very emotionally intense, and my friend was very vulnerable, and she was sharing kind of what she was going through and some of the suffering that she was going through. And the moment ended, and we kind of all dispersed. And because I know this friend and I know her personality and what she's been through, I knew that actually what she needed in that moment was like a healthy distraction. She was so spent. She was so spent from the vulnerability of that moment that what she needed was, I told her about a new hairstylist that I found. And I said in the moment, I was like, I'm going to get my hair cut soon. And I was very excited about it. And she was like, oh, really? So, engage with me on it. And then I said in the middle of it, also, I saw what you just did and that it was really hard. I imagine that you're really spent and that you might want to talk about something silly like hair cutting. And she was like, yes, oh my God, please. I don't want to talk about it anymore. I was like, okay. So anyways, we just keep talking about my silly haircut. And so I think I would say that too, is like, yes, I think in general, acknowledging the hard thing, no matter the circumstances, is a good idea. And I feel like I lean more in that direction than anything else. And also knowing the person that you're talking to and that they might need something else.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, knowing when to ask, when to give empathy and say, hey, let's talk about it, and when to say, hey, let's not talk about it, let's do something silly. No, that's amazing. That's great. I love that. Yolanda, do you have any thoughts on that?
I agree with what Kelsey said. I think it's super important to be able to acknowledge to family members or friends, hey, I recognize you're going through a hard moment, and to give them permission not to talk about it, but also to be a container if they want to talk about it. And for me, I do think often in the same way that Kelsey reframed it, how would I want to
Yes.
enter into the grief of another person? And for me, it always includes looking deeply into their eyes. Often I cry with the person because that's just how I'm wired, but good, solid, strong, deep hugs are important. And I know not everybody's affectionate. So even sometimes asking permission for that. But those seem like really simple things. And sometimes they get overlooked in the awkwardness of the moment. We don't know what to do with ourselves. And we're trying to relieve our own discomfort in the awkwardness. So we don't do for the other person what really needs to be done. And not only is being a container for someone else healing for them, but it's healing for us because we're entering into a partnership with what God is doing in their lives. So in that way, I think he brings a blessing to the situation.
That is so good. That is so amazing. Yeah. And I think we sometimes when we're looking at someone else's grief, we get so caught up with the idea that we have to do something big and grand in order
Yes.
for them to
Right.
feel that we empathize with them when really it could just be the hand on the back, a big hug, just looking into their eyes and saying, "You good? Do you need something?"
Yeah.
Or, yeah, that's really good. So I'm going to switch gears just a little bit, still talking about Thanksgiving, or giving thanks and um, grieving. So this is a season where we are supposed to come together and worship God and give thanks for all that He has done and given us. And I'm going to kind of switch over here for a second. Um, I wanted to talk about that grieving is not always just about being sad, but that grieving can be an act of worship. And so I had written something a long time ago, and one of the things I had researched was that the Israelites at one point were required to have all these feasts and festivals that had certain offerings that they had to give, and they were the burnt offering, the grain offering, the peace offering, the guilt offering. And so in my article, I kind of talked about all those different offerings and what they meant to the Lord and how some of them were for Thanksgiving and whatnot. But there was one offering I focused on, and it was the grain offering. And it was meant to be to represent our dependence on God, because it declared that He was in charge of all things and that we had to rely on Him to provide for us, because of course grain goes back to food and our, what we need, resources. But at the time when a lot of this was being given, grain, they were in the wilderness, and so grain was not kind of available. It was scarce. And so for them to have to find this and then offer it as an offering to God was costly for them. And so, I just thought that was really interesting to me, that it was kind of like grief. And so I wrote that he provides for all of our needs, including comfort. That comfort is a need, that we rely on Him to comfort us in our grief, to provide peace when our hearts are breaking, that He doesn't always provide the answers or the reasons for our grief, but that He does provide comfort and peace and sustains us. And that offering grief as a worship declares that even in our pain, we know God is in control, and that He is the provider for all of our needs, and that He is in control of all things. And so I just wanted to kind of ask you, what your thoughts might be of what I just read, about grief being an offering of worship to the Lord.
Yeah, it makes me think of the story of the widow. I don't remember the amounts, or was it pennies? What? But the gist of the story is that what the widow has to offer is nothing compared to what a wealthy man has to offer. Or like, let's say a wealthy man has $1 million and offers $1,000 to the Lord, and the widow has 3 pennies to her name and offers all 3 of those pennies to the Lord. Those 3 pennies are more precious to the Lord than $1,000 from the wealthy man,
Yep.
because she gave all that she had. So that's what it makes me think of. And yeah, I think in seasons of grief and suffering, sometimes that outpouring to the Lord is all that we have. Sometimes like that guttural cry of pain
Mm-hmm.
towards the Lord is those 3 pennies from the widow. It is worship, it is prayer, it is connection, it is intimacy, it's all of those things in one. And it is, again, it's all that we have, I think, sometimes in our, like, what did my relationship with the Lord look like in deep suffering and grief? It looked like crying, screaming,
Mm-hmm.
it looked like a lot of that. And yes, that's what it makes me think of, is just that, um, it almost makes me think of like a child trying to connect, a child before they can speak, before they can, like, the need is so great, um, to connect with someone, to care for them. And
Yeah.
yet the ability to articulate it is so low, so minimal. And yeah,
Mm.
so I guess all of this is a roundabout way to say, I think so. I think I agree with the idea that grief can be worship. And that sometimes everything that we have to offer, even if it's very little, and I say that with like zero like shame towards people, including myself, in their grief, is like, the reality is like sometimes that's just where grief brings us, is to a place of um of not having much to give, and yet what we do have to give, the Lord finds precious, and I think does glorify
Mm-hmm.
Him, in a way, and which is very humbling. I think that's very humbling to think about God being glorified by those moments.
Yolanda, did you have anything?
Sure. Um, I think when we're grieving, we are breaking open the most honest pieces of ourselves. I think it's an acknowledgement of everything that's deep down inside that we might not fully express in other seasons. So I think that might be part of why it feels like such a powerful movement of worship, because we're acknowledging the deepest part of ourselves, but we're reaching out to the only one who really understands and has
Yeah.
any potential to do anything about it. Maybe not changing the circumstances, although maybe changing the circumstances, but he certainly can help with the healing of our hearts. And Don, I have to be honest, I had a little bit of reaction when you sent the question and talked about God's sovereignty, because for me, in moments of grief, that is not a comfort. That God is in control is
Well, I
not
agree.
nearly as powerful as the thought that God is with me. He might be in control of the situation. And I do think that's part of our worship, is acknowledging, yes, I know you are the creator of the universe and the creator of my soul. But just the fact that he would stoop to be with me in those deepest, darkest places feels more powerful than the feeling of that he's in control. And
Yeah.
recently, Kelsey actually loaned me a book called The Lord is My Courage by KJ Ramsey. And in that book, she talked about how in Western culture, oftentimes we take the Psalm, the 23rd Psalm, which is sort of the framework of her whole book, and how we interpret a little bit differently. Thy rod and thy staff comfort me. And we often look at the rod as punishment, but that in Middle Eastern culture, the rod is a source of protection for us. And that our good shepherd is always with us. Like, he does not leave his flock, and he doesn't leave any of us alone and destitute. So in that vein, I feel like worshiping is just acknowledging that I'm hurt and you're with me. And I recognize I'm never going to be alone in this moment, no matter how lonely it feels. Um, you've created me to reach out back to you in all of my hurt.
Yes, that's good. Yeah, and that reminds me too, one of my favorite passages in Job, and I'm actually listening to Job again for like a millionth time. But in Job, he talks about at the beginning, when he lost everything, he rent his clothes, he fell on the ground, like Kelsey said, this guttural cry of pain out to the Lord. And then he said, but I know he is my Lord, so he's like, I'm not going to sin against him, even though I'm in all this pain. And his friends come to him and they berate him and they call him, they say, well, if you had just done this, or if you had just not the comfort that he needed. But my favorite part of Job is when God comes to him and answers him face to face. And to me, and even though we don't quite understand everything as to why God answered about, were you there when I made the heavens and you have the storehouse? Like, we don't understand all that. I don't understand all of that. But the picture of Job crying out to God in that guttural pain and God coming and meeting him face to face. God could have stood off to the side and said, hey, I'm in control and you just got to deal with it. Or he could have just not said anything and just let Job wallow and deal with his own sorrow. But the picture of God coming down and meeting him face to face and answering him, to me, is so powerful, because it does show that he is a God who cares about what we're going through. And then fast forward to Jesus coming and meeting us here face to face in our own sorrow and going through it with us. It is just a picture that we don't have a God who just is distant from us. He is a God who suffers with us. And I do agree with you, Yolanda. It's very, very powerful. So, what do you guys think about the thought that grief is not always just about being sad? I think some people think, well, if you're sad, then you're grieving, or if you're grieving, you're always sad. And, I've had some people say, well, isn't it time to be over it? And I'm
Oh, gosh.
oh, do you have any thoughts about grief not always just being about sadness?
Well, I think grief can often include anger, for sure.
Oh, totally. Totally, yes.
So there are those moments of that's very different than sadness. But also grief I think it can contain some rejoicing. You're grieving over something that you've lost. And obviously, whatever that loss is, it was a good thing. So in the grief, you're acknowledging that good thing and you're still celebrating that whether it was a person or an event or a season of your life, that was part of you for a long time. So, if it's a loss of health, well, there's a thought of, but I had health for a while and I'm acknowledging that I had this good thing and then it was taken from me. Or if it's a loved one, I'm acknowledging that I had this wonderful relationship and now this person has been taken from me. So I think there can be lots of emotions other than just sadness. And I think also we can do a little dance in and out of all of those emotions. The sadness can be pervasive for a while, but it can also take a back seat for a while. And then sometimes other events will bring it back to the fore. So I think it's okay that it's not linear. And, there have been a lot of studies that have been produced about grief and how it's definitely not something that we just go through this solid phase of stages. We drift in and out of lots of bits and pieces of grief as we move along the journey. And it's kind of a cliche, but it's true. The grief is never really finished this side of heaven, but we engage it differently as we move along the journey.
Oh, I love that we dance in and out of all of those stages. It's not linear. Having been told by several different people, or have been asked, oh, you're still grieving about that? Wasn't that a long time ago? I'm like, grief is not something you go through. It is something you're living with. And it just, like, it will, if you've been touched deeply by the loss of someone close to you, or the loss of health, or there's a lot of different kinds of grief. It's not just about, I've lost someone I loved, somebody died, or those kinds of things. There's a lot of different kinds. It is something that it will be with you, and like you said, pop up. There'll be moments where all of a sudden I think of my mom and tears come back to my eyes, and it's been 7 years. So it's great. So you, Kelsey, you kind of reacted to that, aren't you over it yet? So did you have a thought about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think it brings me a lot of comfort to remember that God's perspective, God's timeline is eternal. And so there is no running out of time with God. And so, yeah, I think I don't know, grief is a complicated thing. And I agree with what Yolanda shared too, just about it's not linear. And that you can come in and out of it. And even in like, it's true that there was like 3 years of my life that were just like, when I reflect on them, they feel like just dark and heavy. And also, I also could tell you really joyful times amidst the middle of that whole season. And sometimes in the heaviness of that season of grief and suffering, there's like very, very angry times. And then there's just like very deep sadness, like almost getting down to like depression. Sometimes it feels more like anxiety and sadness together. And so, yeah, I think grief is more than just one note, and it's more than just one feeling. And yeah, I would just say I think that it does feel like there's some pressure, maybe culturally or something, to like be making progress and to be producing something in our grief. And I just think that the further I get into my life, the more I feel like that is just not from the Lord. That's not God's expectation. And I don't think he needs us to ever be done. His capacity, like God's container to hold our experiences and our emotions, is infinite. Like he never runs out of space for us coming back to him and saying, still feel sad, and I still feel grief over this loss. I still wish you would have done this differently, God. And I don't think he ever runs out of space for those conversations. Yeah, because he's infinite. And I'm just really, really grateful for that. So I think when I was beginning to come out of like this really heavy season, I have this very distinct memory of driving from Augusta, which is where I had a bone marrow transplant. We were driving back to Spartanburg, where we live. And I was saying to Adam, like, I'm like having some anxiety. And it was that feeling that you're describing, Dawn, of like, I feel like I'm running out of time to grieve. Like, I feel like because things are getting better, there's now going to be an expectation that I'm just okay with everything that just happened. And I just don't know if I can be. Like, I just don't know if I can look back and say, but it's okay, God is good. And what do I do with that? Is that okay? And the verse that came to mind then was the verse about the Lord collects our tears in a bottle. And it was such a helpful image of like, I imagine there's like a stopper in the top, like the tears evaporate off your cheeks, but God has them in a bottle. And he's not running out of space for our grief, for our tears. He'll just get a bigger bottle. It's like, if we're running out of space, God's like, I'll just get a bigger bottle. It's fine. It's never going to be too much for him. And I'm just really grateful for that. I'm really grateful for that part of God's character.
I do want to, something that popped up in my head when you were talking was, I need to be thankful, or I need to be okay with this, or I need to thank God for it. There is a culture and maybe it's a Christian culture that's maybe starting to dissipate now. I'm seeing less of it. But there used to be the culture of you have to be thankful for anything and everything that God is throwing at you. And if you're not thankful and grateful, that's almost equivalent to being sinful. Because you're not being joyful that you're going through something hard and thanking God for everything he does for you. And I think that is, like you said, that's not necessarily where God wants us to be. To kind of, I feel like that's more of masking what's going on with us.
Yes.
And saying, well, I'm just going to be thankful. Thank you, God. And we're not really thankful. We're crying out inside, and it's fake. And I don't think that that's what God wants.
Well, I think there's a misinterpretation there, because we have the verse that says, in everything give thanks. but it doesn't say for everything, give thanks, right? So there's a real difference.
Yes.
We can absolutely still be thankful for things in the midst of our deepest, hardest grief, but we're not thankful for the thing that is bringing us grief.
Right.
So there's a massive difference there. Just one tiny word.
Yes. Oh, it is a big difference. And I agree. Like, to be able to say, I praise God and thank God in this grief, not for the circumstances
Yes.
of the grief. I think that's a big
Right.
that's a big difference.
I know this is a really corny example, but this is something I do often. I jump in the shower, and it is my one absolute place to be completely alone. And I'm very cold natured. And so a warm shower often is just one of the most soothing things I can do. So I hop in the shower, and that's the place where I can cry because the shower is washing away all of my tears. So in that moment, I jump in the shower and I'm, Lord, I am so grateful for this hot water and this ridiculous little space where I can be completely naked before you. I mean, I really think of that imagery because there aren't other spaces where I'm comfortable being like that. So in that moment, I am thankful, but also at the same time, I'm letting it all surface. I'm letting all of the grief just well up and pour out. So it's a moment of multiple emotions. So often I'm feeling frustration that maybe the grief is continuing, but also feeling hope. As Kelsey mentioned, there's an end in sight, and God is containing this grief and he's doing something with it. He's transforming me in this process. So being able to have all of those emotions, but being thankful for something as silly and tangible as just hot water and a space to just let it all wash off, you know?
So it reminds me of a song I recently came across, and I'll give credit to it in the comments below. And it's from Victory. She's a beautiful artist, and she wrote this song in her latest album called I Don't Have to Pretend. And one of the lines in there is, I don't have to pretend that everything is okay. That's not what Jesus meant when he said to have faith.
Yes.
And she said, if you see me crying, it's because I'm not trying, and I'm not right. They're not the words exactly, but she's saying, I'm not trying to lie about what I'm going through. I'm being honest with everything that is going on in my life. And I think what is important is to give ourselves permission to feel grief, to grieve in our grief, to not feel like we're sinning because we're not saying, oh, thank you, God, for all this pain you've given me. But to say, hey, I'm not okay. And I don't have to pretend I'm okay. I can come before God and say, I have faith in you. I trust you, but I'm still not okay. And I think that's important.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, thank you guys for joining me today on this episode. I'm very excited. I'm so glad we're able to kind of talk about navigating, these seasons of, holidays and family, and what emotions might come up and how to navigate some of that, what we might be able to do, and give ourselves grace, give ourselves a break. And sometimes say, I don't need to be at that family function. And sometimes saying, no, I can. And maybe get myself a buffer like you have, Kelsey. And say, hey, if I give you a look, it means I need a break. Well, thank you so much, guys.
Thank you, Dawn.
And I hope you all have a great Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Grieving with God podcast. I hope you join us again next week.